From KUNC and the NPR network, this is In The NoCo. I'm Erin O'Toole. In 2018, the city of Boulder and Boulder County filed an unusual lawsuit. They sued Exxon, Mobil, and Suncor Energy for contributing to climate change. Climate change, the lawsuit argued, has caused a plethora of problems like flooding, road damage, and an increase in wildfires. The city and county have spent millions of dollars reacting to these problems, and they wanted help paying for it. Since the case was filed in 2018, more communities around the country have followed Boulder's lead and brought similar lawsuits against fossil fuel companies. Earlier this month, the Colorado Supreme Court held a hearing to determine the fate of this case. So while we wait for a decision, we wondered, what are the odds of this lawsuit moving forward? And how might it affect other communities dealing with climate change? To find out, we spoke with Parker Yamasaki. She's been covering the case and the recent hearing for the Colorado Sun. Boulder and Boulder County are claiming that ExxonMobil and Suncor Energy should have to pay for the increased costs of managing the effects of climate change. When this case was first filed 7 years ago, how unusual was a claim like this?
So this was not the first lawsuit of its kind to be filed, and there are now dozens of climate change lawsuits being fought in states across the country that are sort of harmonious with this one. What stood out about this case in 2018 was it was one of the first instances of this fight moving to the interior of the country. So previously, these cases were being filed in coastal states like California and New York, and Colorado, being both inland and with a major oil and gas industry operating here, sort of shifted the scope of what might be possible.
So attorneys for Boulder and Boulder County compared this lawsuit to lawsuits against the tobacco industry and opioid manufacturers, which have been forced to pay tens of billions of dollars in damages. Where do the city and county see similarities?
Right. So the similarities that they see there are this idea that for decades, oil companies have known that their products contribute to climate change and that they have misled the public in order to protect their business interests. And so the line that they're drawing between the tobacco industry and opioid pharmaceuticals is that the companies, they know the danger of their products, but they have an industry to protect, and so they're going to do what they can to cover that up or to, in Boulder's view, mislead the public about those dangers.
Well, ExxonMobil and Suncor certainly do not want to pay for a community to upkeep their roads or to pay for recovery costs after floods and fires or to reimburse lots of communities for those expenses. The oil companies argued that, this question should be decided by regulators rather than in court. Why would they prefer to be regulated instead of hashing it out in the courts?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. It's not necessarily that they're begging for regulation, but I think what they are trying to do is just definitely try to avoid paying what could amount to billions in climate change remediation fees, right? And there's so much that a regulatory body like the Environmental Protection Agency, which is what oversees emissions right now, there's so much that they can do to sort of change a company's behavior. But one of the questions that was kicked around in the lawsuit quite a few times here in Colorado was, well, what if every city in the country decides to file a lawsuit against an oil company? That would essentially be behavioral regulation because the companies would then have to change their behavior in order to not continue paying these constant costs. And so they're saying what you're doing is a regulation. It's not really a lawsuit. And so they're not asking for more regulations, but the cost of regulations will probably be substantially lower than the cost of paying for every city's road repairs.
Boulder County seems prone to natural disasters like wildfire and floods. I'm curious, does that undermine the city and county's case?
I'm not sure how much that would undermine the case. When they filed this case back in 2018, that was before some of the more costly disasters have hit Boulder. And so that was 3 years before the Marshall Fire, which has been considered a climate-caused disaster.
Sure.
Last summer, we also had tons of fires that cost a lot of money in property damage. And so these things, they are picking up frequency, and I think Boulder has been hit really hard by this, but they were not necessarily pointing to specific disasters when they were filing this case. They were saying that the disasters we're going to have to pay for, they're increasing in frequency and intensity, and that is the result of climate change.
Let's talk about what happens next. You've mentioned that there's been a back and forth between federal and state courts about where this lawsuit belongs. Now, after this hearing, the Colorado Supreme Court will either send the case back to a lower court or to federal court. What's likely to happen in those scenarios?
So the U.S. Supreme Court has already kind of declined to take most of these cases or dismiss them. And the oil companies have tried once before to send this one up to federal court, and it was sent back to state court. And so essentially, if it gets sent up to federal court, it's very likely to be dismissed. And that's what the oil and gas companies would like, right?
Mm-hmm.
If it stays in state court, then they're going to have to fight it out based on the legal arguments that they can bring to the table. So again, what we're talking about here is where it should be fought, but it also is talking about the likelihood of this fight even happening and what could happen, what could be decided. The decision is kind of, in a way, contingent on where this is fought. And so that's why it's taken 7 years to get to this point where we're still trying to decide where to fight this out.
Just to zoom out a little bit, from what you can tell, how has the Boulder lawsuit inspired other communities to file their own lawsuits against oil companies?
I don't know if Boulder was the first one to come up with this liability idea, but I do know that a lot of the lawsuits that I've looked at since then have these similar claims. Right now, the U.S. Supreme Court isn't hearing these cases for the most part because when they've made it up to the federal level, the likelihood of a decision going in favor of the oil and gas industry is very high. But if Boulder and say 4 other cases were to sort of tip that scale and the state courts were to rule in favor of these cities and counties, then you have sort of more of a competition going on. And that might be something that the U.S. Supreme Court would be interested in taking up. And so at this point, there aren't really any precedents to show that Boulder would win this case. But if they did, it could have sort of a ripple effect around the country and could change the way that these cases are heard.
Parker Yamasaki is a reporter for the Colorado Sun. We'll include a link to her article about the lawsuit the city and county of Boulder filed against Exxon, Mobil, and Suncor in our show notes and at kunc.org. Before we go today, I want to take a moment to remind you that the In The NoCo team loves hearing from listeners like you. If you have thoughts about our interview today or any other that you've heard and you want to share them with us, drop us a line. Email us at noco@kunc.org. That's NOCO@kunc.org. That's it today for In The NoCo. I'm Erin O'Toole. Thanks so much for listening.